Welcome to Fatal Files. And while we usually go into amusement parks expecting the best day ever, but these people turned it into their last days on Earth over the dumbest reasons possible. From a rider who decided the peak of a 310-foot drop was the perfect time to unbuckle her seatbelt, to another who broke into a restricted maintenance zone to skip the line, triggering a fatal disaster alongside her husband. It was July 19, 2014, in Hershey, Pennsylvania. The afternoon was hot and sticky under partly cloudy skies. Families packed the amusement park as long lines stretched across the park. I've looked into a lot of these cases, and usually you're looking at a tragic mechanical failure. But this one is completely different. Present that morning was 20-year-old Tyler Marshall. Tyler wasn't some quiet kid looking for a niche. He was the type of guy who always had to prove he was the smartest, toughest person in the room. He ran a tiny YouTube channel with almost 4,000 followers, but from what I gathered watching his old clips, it wasn't a passionate review site. He filmed low-effort pranks and boundary-pushing stunts, constantly chasing a viral moment that never came. He treated warning signs and park rules like personal insults to his intelligence. That day, he went to the park hoping to film new content while enjoying the summer break. Because the lines across the park were running over an hour long, the bumper car pavilion was packed, and the ride operators were rushing to cycle people on and off the grid. Now, this specific attraction used heavy, old-school cars surrounded by thick rubber bumpers, running on a massive steel floor with an electrified mesh grid overhead. Because it's a low-speed ride maxing out at maybe 5 miles per hour, the safety restraints are just simple. Loose lap belts meant to keep you from sliding around. To be honest, most people don't give these belts a second thought, but to Tyler, the entire setup was a joke. He openly mocked the teenage ride operator's safety briefing, laughing when told to keep his seatbelt fastened and stay inside the vehicle at all times. As soon as the grid powered up and the car started moving, Tyler decided a normal ride was beneath him. He wanted a dramatic thumbnail for his channel. While the other cars were uncoordinatedly slamming into each other at walking speed, Tyler unbuckled his seatbelt. He didn't just sit there unbuckled, he stood up entirely, planting one foot on the plastic seat and the other on the dashboard, waving his camera around and yelling at his friends in the other cars. What kills me about this part is that he was given a fair warning. The man in the car next to him, a father riding with his young kid, screamed at Tyler to sit down before he got hurt. Tyler just shook his head, laughed, and flashed a middle finger. He'd waited in the heat for this, and he wasn't going to let a stranger ruin his footage. He thought he had perfect balance, and he genuinely believed a 5-mile-per-hour ride couldn't touch him. But Tyler completely misunderstood the physics of momentum. And this is where a brief moment of human error turned a dumb decision into a fatal one. The teenage ride operator, assuming this was just another standard boring cycle, turned their back on the track for just a few seconds to log the line count on a clipboard. That tiny window of zero supervision was all physics needed. Tyler was standing completely upright when two other cars, driven by teenagers who were looking backward and had no idea he was standing, T-boned his vehicle simultaneously from opposite sides. At 5 miles per hour, a seated rider barely feels a jolt, but Tyler had 0 points of contact and a high center of gravity. The sudden dual impact violently jarred his car. Tyler instantly lost his footing on the smooth plastic. The kinetic force launched his 130-pound frame sideways, and he spilled right out of the vehicle, belly flopping onto the slick, greasy steel floor directly in the path of oncoming traffic. Now you have to understand the hidden danger here. The danger with bumper cars isn't the speed, it's the sheer weight. A standard bumper car weighs roughly 400 to 500 pounds of solid steel and rubber. When you add a driver, you have over half a ton of metal moving with massive momentum. Another rider, completely unaware that Tyler had fallen onto the track, stepped on the accelerator and drove straight toward him. Tyler's dropped camera later showed only fragments of what happened next. The heavy bumper car struck him and forced him violently into the outer steel guardrail surrounding the ride area. Witnesses later told investigators that Tyler's head and upper body took the full force of the impact against the rail. By the time the operator heard the screaming, looked up, and hit the emergency stop button, it was already too late. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but Tyler died from catastrophic head and neck injuries caused by being crushed between the moving car and the fixed steel barrier. When investigators later reviewed the footage from Tyler's dropped camera and the park's surveillance, they confirmed the ride hadn't malfunctioned. Investigators concluded that Tyler's decision to stand inside the moving vehicle caused the accident, though the park later updated its ride monitoring procedures. It was August 19, 2016, and the desert outside Reno, Nevada was still radiating heat long after the sun had started to sink. The dry air out there doesn't cool down easily, and by evening, the temperature on the flatlands was still hovering in the low 90s. Vicki Glome was 43 years old. She had made her money in real estate investment, buying, developing, and flipping properties across the American West. She was sharp, ambitious, and completely addicted to the spotlight. The kind of person who didn't just host parties, she performed at them. She had poured nearly $11 million into making sure she had the most unforgettable backyard in Nevada. Across 14 acres behind her estate, Vicki had built a fully operational private amusement park, carnival booths, a miniature coaster, bumper cars, food stands, and at the center of it all, a compressed air launch tower. The ride shot a steel capsule roughly 85 feet straight up. It was the crown jewel of the property. She hosted invitation-only events regularly, and this night was one of her biggest, a packed influencer party where dozens of guests were actively live streaming. The cameras were always rolling at Vicki's parties, and I think that's exactly what drove most of the decisions she made that night. The compressed air launch tower had a troubled history. The hardware had been purchased secondhand from a recently closed amusement attraction. Earlier that week, contractors had placed the ride in a manual diagnostics and calibration mode used for testing launches and timing systems. In that setting, several normal safety interlocks were temporarily bypassed so technicians could cycle the ride during maintenance. The mode was never intended for passengers, but the system had not been switched back to full operational status before the party began. One side of the shoulder harness had also failed to fully latch during previous test cycles. Maintenance logs confirmed a sensor occasionally registered as locked even when it wasn't. Contractors had flagged it. Vicki had been told. None of it stopped the party. I keep on thinking about how many warnings does it take before Vicki shuts the whole thing down. That evening, Gerson, in his early 40s, who had been drinking while helping manage attractions, entered the operator booth. While handling the controls for the livestream countdown sequence, he initiated the launch cycle without realizing the ride was still running in manual test mode. Because the system was still configured for diagnostics, the capsule launched immediately without the full restraint verification sequence normally required during standard operation. Vicki was already inside. She had climbed in alone in front of a crowd holding up their phones. She was wearing only the lap restraint, skipping the shoulder harness because she wanted the ride to feel faster on camera. And this is the kind of mistake that probably never happens if he's sober. Based on experience, when alcohol's involved, people get careless without realizing it. Without proper upper body restraint, her torso lifted violently as the capsule climbed the rails. The partially latched shoulder harness gave way completely. Her upper body rose freely while her lower body remained caught by the lap belt, and she slammed into part of the steel support structure running beside the track as the capsule accelerated upward. The impact caused catastrophic injuries to her chest and neck. She was pulled free of the seat near the upper section of the tower, roughly 8 stories above the concrete, and witnesses described her striking a steel crossbeam before falling to the base of the loading platform. Deputies arrived to find the ride still powered on. Vicki was pronounced dead at the scene from catastrophic head, chest, and spinal injuries. Investigators confirmed the shoulder restraints had never fully engaged before the capsule fired. The man who triggered the launch was questioned, and witnesses described both his location and his condition at the time. The ride was dismantled months later. It was March 11, 2018, at a mid-sized water park in Southern California. A woman had been arguing over a basic safety rule most people followed without thinking. At first, it just slowed things down, but within minutes, it pulled someone else into a situation they had no control over. Linda Foss was 57 years old, visiting the park on a short trip with her husband. They had driven in from out of state, treating it as a simple break without much planning. She worked part-time at a small inn, managing the front desk, handling bookings, payments, and guest check-ins. Routine work she had done long enough to expect things to run a certain way. That afternoon, they headed to one of the park's main attractions, a simulation-style tram ride with continuously moving vehicles that fed into a tunnel of sudden jolts. By the time they reached the loading area, the line had already slowed behind her. Linda stopped at the entrance, arguing about the seatbelt instead of moving with the group. She pointed at it and refused to use it, saying it looked dirty and that she was wearing a white dress. She asked for a clean seatbelt and a different seat. The attendant explained it was required and regularly cleaned, but she kept pushing back, questioning why it even mattered for a short ride. Then, she pointed at one of the seats and refused to sit, saying it wasn't clean enough. Staff repeated that everything was cleared between cycles and that they needed to keep the line moving with the continuous loading system, but she stayed where she was. Behind her, people began to get irritated, shifting in place as the line backed up and the next group waited to board. However, she didn't move. She kept arguing, pointing at the seat, asking for a different one, questioning why she had to use it at all. The line backed up behind her as attendants repeated the same instructions. I've seen this before, when someone stops everything over something small and no one can move until they're done. Even as empty seats passed through the loading belt, she stayed near the edge of the platform, still talking, still holding things up, while staff tried to get her to either board quickly or step fully behind the marked safety line. Because the ride operated on a slow, continuous movement, the vehicles kept passing through at a steady pace. As she continued arguing, she shifted backward without looking, stepping past the painted boundary line that separated guests from the moving track area. There was a narrow, recessed gap beside the platform, normally kept clear when guests stay within the marked loading position, but now exposed because she had moved out of place. Her foot came down into that recessed edge as she turned. She lost her balance instantly. With no stable footing, she fell sideways into the path of the moving tram. The vehicle was already passing through at low speed, but the weight and momentum were enough. Within seconds, the side of the carriage struck her before the operator could fully engage the emergency stop. Everything happened too fast. Staff hit the stop controls immediately, but the movement had already caused severe blunt force injuries. Guests nearby backed away as operators rushed in and called for emergency services. Linda was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived and attempted resuscitation on site before transporting her to a nearby hospital. Despite continued efforts, she was pronounced dead shortly after. Based on the findings, authorities determined that Linda's death resulted from blunt force trauma caused by contact with the moving ride after stepping outside the designated loading position. As for the case, it was reviewed for possible liability and safety concerns. Investigators noted that the ride was operating as designed, with clear floor markings and verbal instructions given. Her movement beyond the safety boundary placed her in an area not intended for guests during operation. In the end, no criminal charges were filed, but the incident was ruled a preventable death tied to unsafe behavior in a restricted zone. The park later reinforced barriers at the loading edge and updated procedures to stop the belt sooner when guests refused to comply. It was June 14th, 2017, in Sandusky, Ohio. The park was running at full capacity, dispatching trains every few minutes. From the outside, everything looked routine. Lines moving, restraints checked, trains clearing the station without delay. But at the loading stage, before the ride even began, a clear warning was already being given and then ignored. Earlier that afternoon, Melissa Raines, 38, stepped into the queue. She managed a boutique clothing store, and that day, she visited the theme park with a client and her teenage daughter as a favor, trying to keep the relationship intact after a difficult stretch in business. Most of the day, she followed along, stepping into rides she normally wouldn't choose. Backing out would have felt awkward. She spent her days pushing through hesitation and getting past resistance, but in a system built on fixed rules, that instinct doesn't work the same way. At the ride entrance, a test seat sat off to the side. Melissa stepped in, pulled the lap bar down, and it stopped short. There was a visible gap between the restraint and her lap. The operator checked it, then told her it wouldn't lock safely. He pointed out the issue clearly. There was too much space between the bar and her body. Bulky layers around her waist and hips were preventing the bar from sitting low enough, where it needed to. He asked her to remove the outer layer and try again. She didn't. She brushed it off, saying it was close enough and that she'd be fine, then stepped out and moved back into the line anyway. And this is the part people always argue with. I've seen it over and over. People saying they'd just try again, or that it would probably still be fine. But that test seat isn't there to slow you down. It's there to stop you when something isn't right. By the time she reached the platform, the train was already loading. Seats were filling quickly, and operators were moving fast to keep the cycle going. She sat down, outer layer still on, and pulled the lap bar toward her. It clicked, but not in the position it needed to be. The restraint locked, but it sat higher than intended. Instead of securing firmly across her lower body, it rested above it, leaving a gap that wasn't obvious during a quick check. An operator came by and pressed down once. It didn't move further. The indicator showed locked. No one asked her to adjust or remove the layer again. And that's how it passed, because the system confirmed the lock, not how well it actually secured her. From the outside, everything looked correct. The restraint was down, the signal cleared, and the train was dispatched. As the train climbed the lift hill, nothing felt wrong. The upward motion pressed her into the seat, masking the looseness. Even a poor fit can feel stable when the force is pushing you down. But that only lasts until the top. As the train crested, the chain released, and the motion shifted forward. The downward force dropped, then reversed as the train tipped into the first drop. And this is where everything goes wrong. As the negative force took over, her body began to lift. The layers around her waist compressed further, removing what little contact the restraint had. The gap widened instantly. Her hips rose first, then her torso, and there was nothing left holding her in place. The separation happened as the train tipped into the drop. Riders behind her saw it immediately. The seat in front of them was suddenly empty. It happened too fast for anyone to react. Her body struck a steel support structure roughly 40 feet below, then fell into a restricted area beneath the track as the train continued. Emergency services were called, but the injuries were fatal. The medical examiner confirmed blunt force trauma. The investigation found the restraint had locked, but not in a position that could secure her under changing forces, an issue already identified at the test seat. Nothing failed. The system worked as designed. The only thing that changed was the decision to move forward after being told not to. It was July 18th, 2016, in Anaheim, California, and by early afternoon, the parade route had filled in tighter than usual, with families pressed shoulder to shoulder along the barriers, phones raised, waiting for the floats to pass. And from a distance, everything still looked smooth, even though the space between the moving platforms and the crowd had already started to narrow. That's where Daniel Reyes, 36, made a decision that only takes a second to commit to, but doesn't leave room to undo. He was there with his wife and their 8-year-old son, Mateo, on their first trip to Disneyland. It was something they had planned for months, saving where they could, booking everything carefully, building the kind of trip you tell your kid is going to be unforgettable. Daniel worked as a delivery driver, long hours, steady routine, not the kind of job that leaves a lot of room for breaks like this. But this trip mattered to him. He was the one who insisted they do the parade, the photos, the full experience. He wanted Mateo to remember it. I get that mindset more than I probably should, because when you're with family, especially kids, there's this pressure to make moments feel bigger than they actually are. And by that point in the day, they already had a phone full of pictures, poses with various characters and attractions, the kind of everyone takes on at Disney. But Daniel wanted something different, something funny, something that would stand out later. As the frozen float approached, Mateo pointed it out immediately, pulling at his dad's arm, already excited. Daniel stepped forward slightly, angling his phone, then hesitated. And this is where the decision happens. Instead of staying behind the barrier, he stepped over it. Not in a rush, just quick enough that no one stopped him. He moved alongside the float for a couple of seconds, matching its slow speed, holding his phone out, trying to frame himself in front of it like he was part of the scene. It was meant to be a joke, him pretending to join the parade for a split second before stepping back. But the float was still moving. When Daniel jumped, it wasn't a full attempt to climb onto the float, just a quick hop to get himself into frame as it passed. But he misjudged the distance. His foot didn't land where he expected, and instead of finding stable footing, it came down too close to the moving edge. His balance shifted immediately. One foot searched for solid ground, but there wasn't enough space to recover. The forward motion of the float threw off his timing, and within seconds, his footing gave out. He tried to step back, but his movement was out of sync with the float beside him. He lost balance and fell backward onto the pavement, landing hard on his side and back. For a moment, it still looked like a normal fall. But the float continued forward at the same steady pace, and he was now directly behind it, within the clearance space near the rear section. As he tried to get up, the distance closed too quickly. The rear structure made contact first, knocking him back down before he could regain his footing. The vehicle continued moving, and by the time the operator recognized what was happening and initiated a stop, the float had already moved over him. People nearby started reacting, but not immediately. For a few seconds, it still looked like someone trying to get back up. Then, it became clear something was wrong. Emergency responders reached him within minutes, but the injuries were already critical. The report later confirmed severe blunt force trauma consistent with being struck and run over by a moving vehicle, leading to cardiac arrest at the scene. It was August 3, 2013, at a wooden roller coaster in a Northern California amusement park. Evening crowds gathered near the station as trains blasted through a high-speed flyby at nearly 50 miles per hour. A chest-high metal barrier separated spectators from the track, marking the edge of the ride's safety clearance area. Standing near that barrier was Logan Price, 22, a community college baseball player finishing his summer semester. He worked part-time at a sporting goods store and planned to transfer the following year. On the field, he relied on quick reactions and precise timing. Friends described him as relaxed and playful, the kind of person who filled quiet moments in line with jokes or harmless challenges. That evening, he carried an oversized inflatable baseball bat, bright plastic, hollow, and light enough to swing easily. It had been bought earlier that day from a Midway prize booth and quickly became a prop for photos and jokes as the group moved through the park. When the coaster roared past the station the first time, Logan lifted the inflatable bat and made a mock swing toward the train, stopping short before it reached the railing. The bat never crossed the barrier. His friends laughed, and the train disappeared down the track. A minute later, the coaster returned again. Logan repeated the motion, raising the bat as the train approached and pulling it back at the last second. The timing became the joke, pretending to hit the train while staying just behind the barrier. The bat never touched the ride, but each attempt edged closer to the boundary that separated spectators from the moving cars. By the third pass, the rhythm of the coaster was predictable. The train burst from the curve and rushed toward the flyby with the same steady speed. Logan leaned slightly over the railing and extended the inflatable bat farther than before, aiming the rounded end toward the passing train as if lining up another mock swing. This time, the tip dipped just below the top of the barrier and briefly entered the ride's clearance space, the invisible envelope the train occupies as it passes. The lead car reached the spot a fraction of a second later. The corner of the car struck the inflatable surface. The hollow plastic compressed instantly and snapped downward under the force of the moving train. The sudden impact jerked the bat violently out of Logan's hands. Already leaning forward over the railing, the motion shifted his balance. His center of gravity moved past the barrier as the bat was ripped away. His upper body tipped forward and his head dropped toward the squared steel post that anchored the railing beside him. Witnesses later described the movement as a single motion. Logan's forehead struck the edge of the steel post before his body collapsed against the base of the barrier. The inflatable bat skidded across the concrete several feet away. Guests nearby alerted staff immediately. Ride operators stopped the coaster, and park personnel called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found Logan unconscious with severe head trauma. He was transported to a nearby trauma center, where doctors attempted emergency treatment to reduce pressure inside his skull. The autopsy later documented a depressed fracture to the frontal bone caused by impact with the steel railing post. The injury produced extensive brain trauma and swelling within the skull. Despite surgical efforts to relieve pressure, the damage proved irreversible. The official cause of death was ruled traumatic brain injury from blunt force impact. The following morning, the park temporarily closed the viewing area beside the flyby. Additional mesh shielding was installed above the railing to prevent objects from entering the track space, and updated signage reinforced the requirement that guests keep all items behind the barrier. Investigators relied on staff reports and multiple guest statements to reconstruct the sequence of events. Each attempt to swing the inflatable bat had brought it slightly closer to the track until the final pass placed it inside the coaster's clearance zone. It was July 18, 2016, inside an indoor water park in Ohio, where the air felt heavy with humidity, and the constant sound of rushing water echoed through the enclosed structure. The lighting barely changed, giving the place a controlled, almost artificial atmosphere. Lines moved steadily, and riders kept entering slides without pause. Haley Vant was 19, working a part-time job, and had come to the park with co-workers after a late shift. She had energy even after long days, the kind of person who kept things going when others were ready to leave. That night it was her, but there was something more specific driving her. Earlier, she had timed one run on the enclosed body slide, fast enough to turn into a small competition. Quick glances at phones, laughing claims about the best time. She wanted one more run to beat it. They had gone through several attractions, but she kept returning to that same enclosed slide. It was fully covered, around 180 feet long, with tight curves. Earlier, staff noted the water flow wasn't as strong. It had been reduced due to a partial blockage, but the ride remained open. Riders were spaced manually. At one point in line, someone mentioned the slide felt slower. She heard it and chose to go anyway, even joking she'd push off harder to make up for it. By the time she reached the front again, spacing wasn't consistent. The rider ahead entered slowly and didn't build enough momentum. What happened next had to be pieced together. No one outside saw it in real time. She entered feet first, pushing off harder than before, gaining speed at first. But deeper into the slide, reduced water flow started to matter. Friction increased, slowing her earlier than expected. You can feel the shift before it fully happens. The speed drops early, the sound of water changes. The slide doesn't carry the way it should. As she came around one bend, she hit the rider ahead, hard. A sudden stop that folded her forward into the curve. That was it, the exact moment everything locked in place. From here, there was no clean way out. The rider ahead had stalled. Now both were stuck in a tight section with no movement. Within seconds, it escalated. Another rider entered behind her, unaware, and slammed into the same bottleneck. The space compressed instantly. What had been a delay became a full blockage. Haley's position shifted from the impact. Her upper body forced forward and twisted. There was nowhere to go. Someone behind, someone in front. Hard walls on both sides. Then the water kept coming. Instead of carrying them forward, the water pushed into the block section, hitting them in uneven bursts. It wasn't enough to move anyone. She tried to move, but there was no space. The curve and the other riders kept her in place. From there, she couldn't reposition. Her breathing became uneven as water kept getting in the way. She couldn't get a full breath. Inside the enclosed tube, sound didn't carry well. Any calls for help stayed inside. At the top, dispatch continued briefly before operators realized riders weren't exiting on time. Once operators stopped sending riders, they initiated a check. Maintenance accessed the slide, but it still took minutes to reach the blockage. By the time they reached her, she was unresponsive. She was removed, and responders attempted resuscitation, but she was later pronounced dead. The findings pointed not to classic positional asphyxia, but to compressive restriction and water-related airway compromise during the pileup. She couldn't get effective breaths while intermittently inhaling water, trapped with no way to recover, made worse by the delay. The review pointed to reduced water flow, inconsistent spacing, and delayed recognition. The slide was closed and procedures were adjusted. It was August 12, 2016, in Orlando, Florida. Afternoon thunderstorms had passed earlier, leaving the air hot and humid as families filled the theme park. Melissa Kane was there with some coworkers. She was a 34-year-old single mom and a teacher's assistant who had spent years scrimping and saving just to afford this trip. Between working, raising 2 kids alone after a tough divorce, and picking up extra shifts, she rarely got a break. Melissa was also a marathon runner in training, and hearing that, it hit close to home. This was supposed to be her day. Her friends knew her as incredibly hardworking, but she was also impatient and hated standing still. Her whole life ran on a tight schedule. That afternoon, they hopped on a log flume ride. Halfway through, a sensor glitched, and the ride ground to a halt inside a dark, enclosed tunnel. Over the speakers, staff told everyone to stay seated while maintenance sorted it out. It was a routine breakdown, nothing dangerous, and usually took just a few minutes to fix. But as the minutes ticked by, Melissa started getting visibly frustrated. Security cameras caught her repeatedly checking her watch and looking toward an exit platform. After about 20 minutes of waiting, she'd had enough. The The flume was still full of water, but Melissa could see a narrow maintenance ledge running alongside the channel. From where she sat, it looked like an easy path to the nearby exit platform. Despite other riders telling her to stay put, she climbed out of the log and stepped onto the ledge. Several passengers later said they thought she was simply trying to walk to the exit herself. At first, she managed a few careful steps. Then her foot slipped on the constantly wet concrete. She lost her balance and fell directly into the water beside the ride vehicle. The current immediately pulled her toward a nearby filtration intake that continued operating even though the ride itself had stopped. Looking at the schematics of these parks, it terrifies me how these massive pumps keep running in the background. Witnesses watched her struggle against the flow, but the moving water kept dragging her closer. She hit the steel intake grate feet first. From what I've read in the investigator reports, the suction instantly pinned her leg against the bars. The force was overwhelming. Emergency services were called immediately. Maintenance workers rushed over and tried to pull her out, but it's incredibly disturbing to realize that the water pressure was just too strong. The suction held her tightly against the grate, preventing her from pulling free. Employees raced to shut down the filtration system, while others tried unsuccessfully to reach her. By the time the pumps were finally switched off and workers got her loose, she had already been underwater for several minutes. Even though paramedics arrived in 8 minutes, it was too late. The autopsy later determined that Melissa drowned after becoming trapped against the intake grate. She also suffered significant injuries to her legs from the force of the suction. An investigation later found that the ride's mechanical glitch didn't cause her death. It happened because she stepped out of the boat into a restricted, dangerous area. Afterward, the park added extra barriers and fencing to keep anyone else from doing the same thing. A few months later, Melissa's co-workers ran the marathon she had been training for, wearing her race number on their shirts to raise money for a youth sports program for her kids. It was May 7th, 2019, and the Ozark Hills outside Branson, Missouri were still holding on to the dampness of an unusually wet spring. The trees were green, but heavy. The soil was soft in places that it shouldn't be. Kevin Broff was 51, an entertainment investor whose fortune came from financing luxury resorts, casinos, and major theme park expansions across the country. After retiring, he spent millions building a private amusement park on wooded land outside Branson. It featured a towering wooden roller coaster, staffed midway games, animatronic attractions, and an underground limestone grotto system beneath the property. The centerpiece was a massive natural cave directly underneath one of the coaster's main support sections. Kevin didn't want it to look like a theme park cave. He wanted it to look expensive. Most attractions use lightweight foam or resin panels for underground theming because they're manageable, safe, and easy to anchor. Kevin rejected that entirely. He imported actual quarry limestone slabs because, in his mind, real stone signaled real money. It was the difference between a rich man's hobby and something that looked like one. The material became a point of pride for him before a single slab was ever installed. And I get him. When you've spent years funding other people's ideas, finally building something of your own makes you want to prove you can do it too and make it even better. He didn't just use limestone for the walls. He used it for the ceiling. Massive quarried slabs anchored into retrofitted support mesh overhead, far heavier than what the system was ever designed to carry. But to Kevin, the weight was the point. Thin panels looked cheap. Real stone had presence. It looked like something that cost what it actually cost. Over time, the cave expanded. New decorative chambers were dug out to make the tour more immersive, pushing deeper and closer to the structural anchor points buried beneath the coaster's support columns above. Every coaster pass sent vibrations shaking down through the ground. Dust would fall from the ceiling cracks whenever a train crossed overhead. The unusually wet spring had been saturating the cave walls for weeks, and visible cracks had begun spreading near portions of the chamber roof. To Kevin, the cracking gave the limestone character. It looked natural. It looked like the real thing. On May 7th, a group of online content creators arrived to film the attractions. Kevin led them personally underground, while coaster operations continued above. The group stopped in the main chamber while Kevin explained how the cave had been built. A coaster train crossed overhead. The rumble shook loose dust from the ceiling, which was routine. But then came a sound that wasn't part of the routine, a deep crack that didn't sound like the track. Pebbles fell first, then small limestone chunks scattered across the walkway. A slab the size of a dining table came down behind the group, partially blocking the entrance tunnel. Kevin moved immediately toward a maintenance passage near the exit staircase. But before he reached it, several ceiling sections gave way directly above him. The first piece struck him across the shoulders and drove him face first onto the concrete path. Additional sections collapsed across his lower body. A water pipe burst and sprayed mud across the chamber. Witnesses scrambled for the service tunnel while the ceiling continued breaking apart. This was the day Kevin had been waiting for. He finally had the audience to see what he had built it all for. What he didn't expect was that the masterpiece he had built had its own plans for the finale. Operators running the coaster above ground didn't trigger an emergency stop immediately because the underground rumbling sounded from the surface like ordinary ride vibration. Emergency crews spent more than an hour stabilizing the remaining structure before safely entering. Kevin was found, pinned beneath several limestone slabs, and pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators documented extensive cracking near the coaster's anchor points above the grotto. Their conclusion was that repeated vibration from daily operations combined with months of water infiltration and the excessive weight of the real limestone ceiling caused cumulative structural failure. The expanded chambers pushed too close to the support anchors were identified as a critical factor. Several underground sections were demolished. The coaster was shut down and never fully reopened. The private amusement park sat largely abandoned after that. It was August 3, 2016, at a local amusement park in Georgia during a crowded summer afternoon. Lines stretched out as staff worked under pressure. An ant pushed past a clear rule. It didn't seem serious at first, but within minutes, it turned into something no one on that ride could fix. Visiting that day was Renee Galveston, 47, and being there wasn't even part of her original plan. Her sister had asked her at the last minute to watch her nephew for a few hours, and instead of keeping things simple, Renee decided to take him to a small local amusement park and turn it into an outing. From the moment they arrived, witnesses said she kept slowing things down, arguing over small details and questioning staff at almost every stop. When her nephew came in just below the height marker, she leaned in close, pointing at the line and calling attendants over, insisting he basically met it, even as the line behind them started backing up. At the measurement point, the result didn't change. Still under. The attendant explained it, but Renee raised her voice, arguing the difference didn't matter and questioning why they were being so strict. Witnesses described her as persistent, with staff repeating the same answer while she kept pushing for a different one. She asked for a supervisor, but got the same answer and stepped away, then came back again. This didn't happen once. It kept going. Each time she came back more direct, more forceful, repeating the same argument, not letting the line move without saying something. People behind her started watching. Some stepped out of line to go to other rides. Eventually, during a shift change, she found a newer attendant. This time, she controlled the moment, positioning her nephew under the bar, keeping him straight, pointing at the line, and insisting, louder than before. The attendant hesitated, and she didn't back off. After a few seconds of pressure, the answer changed. They were let through. The ride itself wasn't a high-speed coaster. It was a small family ride, low elevation, slow dispatch, and designed with a single-position lap bar rather than over-the-shoulder restraints. The system depended on rider size to hold properly against the bar. For adults, it locked firmly. For smaller riders near the minimum height, the fit could leave more space if not checked closely. At the loading platform, everything moved quickly. Renee and her nephew were seated, the lap bar lowered until it clicked, and they were cleared to ride. But the fit wasn't tight on him. There was a visible gap between his body and the bar that would normally be flagged during a proper check. Just before the train fully departed, as it began its slow roll out of the station, Renee raised her voice again, calling out to the operator, saying the restraint didn't feel secure enough for her nephew. Instead of staying seated, she leaned forward over the lap bar, trying to adjust him herself. Below the platform, the ride operator noticed immediately and moved toward the controls, signaling for her to sit back down. But the train had already passed the primary stop point at the station exit. On rides like this, the emergency stop isn't instant once the train clears that section. It requires confirmation and a short delay before the system fully engages to avoid abrupt mechanical stress. She didn't respond right away. And this is the moment where, if you're watching from the side, you can already feel it going wrong. As the train entered its first shallow turn, still moving slowly but no longer perfectly level, the shift in motion was enough. Renee was already leaning forward and partially out of position. When the car rotated slightly, her center of gravity moved past the lap bar. With her weight no longer supported, she lost her footing. Her body pitched sideways. She reached out instinctively, grabbing onto the nearest person beside her, another rider, Evan Cruz, 32, who had been seated properly just one row over. The sudden pull caught him off guard. His upper body was yanked toward her, and with the lateral movement of the turn, it was enough to break his position against the restraint. Neither of them had time to recover. Both of them went over the side of the car. They fell from the slowly moving train down toward the operator walkway below, approximately 8 to 10 feet. The drop wasn't extreme, but it was onto a hard, narrow service path with metal railings and equipment lining the side. Renee hit first, striking the edge of the walkway and railing. Evan came down moments after, hitting the same area with full force. The train continued forward briefly as the operator completed the emergency stop sequence. Within seconds, the system engaged and brought the ride to a halt. From the platform, it was over almost instantly. Staff rushed in as guests backed away. Both Renee and Evan were unresponsive where they had landed. Emergency services were called immediately. Responders attempted resuscitation on site, but both had sustained catastrophic head and chest trauma from the fall and impact. They were pronounced dead shortly after. Authorities found the restraint worked as designed, but the child's size left excess space under the lap bar. Renee's decision to lean forward and grab another rider led to both being pulled from the car. With no intent to harm, no charges were filed, and the deaths were ruled accidental due to unsafe rider behavior and improper restraint fit. After the incident, the park implemented stricter enforcement, mandatory double checks for smaller riders, clearer dispatch holds if a rider signals concern, and updated operator protocols allowing immediate halt authority before a train clears the station zone. It was July 22, 2015, in Phoenix, Arizona, at a crowded water park where a lazy river looped under direct summer heat. Families floated past in tubes, kids stayed near the edges, and lifeguards scanned the water in a steady rhythm. From the outside, everything looked calm and controlled, but underneath, powerful intake systems were constantly pulling water through the ride to keep it moving. Earlier that afternoon, Laura Benton, 39, had been moving through the park like any other guest. She worked part-time as a cashier and spent most of her time taking care of her 2 kids. This trip was just a break from the heat, something simple and affordable. People described her as practical and careful, but also the type who didn't like unclear answers. If something didn't make sense, she pushed until it did. That usually works, until the answer is behind a fence for a reason. The lazy river itself looked simple, but it wasn't just water drifting in a loop. Thousands of gallons were being pulled every minute through intake points hidden along the channel. Those openings were covered with grates designed to spread out suction so no single point became dangerous. Under normal use, the system was safe. But up close, inside restricted areas, the force at those intake points could become dangerous if something blocked the flow directly. After about 15 minutes, she stepped out and approached a lifeguard, asking how the system worked. When the answer stayed general, she pushed further, asking to see it up close. The lifeguard told her clearly that guests weren't allowed past the fence. I can really relate to this, asking one more question like I'm about to uncover something. But in places like this, the vague answer isn't hiding anything. It's usually a warning. The lifeguard pointed toward a fenced maintenance section along the edge of the river and made it clear that guests weren't allowed there. A posted sign reinforced it. That should have been enough. But instead of stepping back, Laura moved along the edge toward it anyway. The area was fenced off, but she moved along the edge and slipped past the barrier anyway, stepping into a space clearly marked for staff only. Inside, the grate was intact, but the suction across its surface was strong. Up close, the water didn't look aggressive, but it moved differently, pulling inward in a way that only became obvious when you were near it. She crouched down beside the grate. And this is what stands out. Nothing about it looks dangerous in the moment. It's just water moving, something familiar enough that you don't question it. She reached down and placed her hand against the grate. The moment her hand covered part of the surface, it reduced the open flow across the grate, concentrating the suction into a smaller area. It wasn't gradual. It locked instantly. She tried to pull back, but her footing slipped on the wet concrete. Her balance shifted forward, pressing more of her arm against the grate and increasing the suction. From above, it didn't look chaotic, just a sudden movement, then stillness. Her body tipped forward, and her upper body was forced down toward the surface. With her arm pinned and no leverage to push herself back up, she couldn't lift her head clear of the water. Two nearby guests reached her within seconds and grabbed her legs, trying to pull her free. But once that kind of suction locks in, especially with her arm pinned and no footing, it wasn't something they could overcome by pulling alone. A lifeguard called for an emergency shutdown, but systems like this don't stop instantly. They wind down. The pumps kept running for a few more seconds, and in a situation like this, those seconds matter. The suction held her in place until the pressure finally dropped. By the time it was released, she was already unresponsive. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. There were no major visible injuries, just minor abrasions where her arm had been pinned. The medical findings confirmed drowning caused by suction entrapment. It kept her from pulling free or keeping her airway above water. It was March 9th, 2014, in Anaheim, California. Midday, packed crowds, the kind of heat that makes everything feel slower than it actually is. The meet and greet line at Town Square stretched longer than usual, with kids waiting, parents hovering, and staff quietly trying to keep everything moving in a space that only works when people follow the flow. A few spots back stood Darren Holt, 26. He wasn't there for photos. He'd come in with his girlfriend, but by that point, he was already irritated with long lines, slow staff, and what he kept calling pointless rules. He worked in freelance sales, the kind of job where confidence easily turns into stubbornness, especially when things don't go your way. I've been in lines like that, where everything starts to feel slower than it actually is, and you catch yourself getting annoyed over things that don't really matter. And what set him off wasn't anything big. It was Mickey. Darren had a folded document in his bag related to a personal issue, and he brought it out and asked for a signature. The character attendant declined and explained that performers stay in character, but Darren repeated the request, raising his voice as the refusal stayed the same. People nearby began to pay attention as the interaction continued. Instead of letting it go, he stepped back and reached into his bag for a solid crystal Mickey figurine he had purchased earlier that day. It was heavier than most souvenirs, with a smooth, polished surface that made it harder to grip securely. While waiting in line, he had been eating, leaving his hands slightly greasy without really noticing. He moved several feet back from the queue, just enough to give himself space, then turned to face the character again. People nearby were still watching, some already sensing the tension from the earlier exchange. Darren raised his arm and made a throwing motion with one hand, aiming toward the character. But as he released the figurine, it slipped from his grip mid-motion. The weight shifted unexpectedly in his hand, and instead of a clean throw, it threw off his balance completely. His upper body leaned back as he tried to correct, but his footing didn't follow. He took a quick step backward, then another, trying to stabilize himself, but his movement had already gone out of sync. The ground beneath him wasn't perfectly even, and with his weight shifting too fast, he couldn't regain control. He lost his balance and fell backward onto the brick pavement, landing hard on his back and neck. The impact didn't look dramatic at first, just a fall, but the angle of it forced his head and upper spine into the ground with more force than it appeared. For a moment, people hesitated. It still looked like something he might recover from, but he didn't move. Staff approached quickly and began clearing the area as bystanders realized he wasn't getting up. Paramedics arrived within minutes and began assessment, but he was unresponsive. He was later pronounced at the scene. The cause of death was determined to be severe cervical spine trauma resulting from the backward fall. Investigators reviewed footage and witness recordings and found no equipment failure or external malfunction. The sequence came down to a single moment: the loss of grip, the shift in balance, and the fall that followed. It was July 9th, 2016, at a traveling fair set up on a wide gravel lot outside a small rural town in Ohio. The midway baked under the afternoon sun. One attraction towered above the others, a tall metal burlap sack slide rising nearly 4 stories. Ricky Mendez, 29, had spent most of his life working traveling fairs. His grandfather ran game booths, his father operated rides, and Ricky learned maintenance work as a teenager. By the time he was an adult, he was known on the circuit as someone who kept attractions running without delays. When equipment slowed down or jammed, he preferred fast solutions over careful ones. That summer, Ricky was responsible for maintaining the tall metal slide. Riders climbed to the top carrying burlap sacks and descended polished steel lanes designed for speed. The lanes were normally coated with wax, but heat and dust had turned the surface sticky. Riders were slowing halfway down instead of sliding cleanly to the bottom. The correct way to remove the buildup was to wait for the metal to cool and use a non-flammable cleaner. Ricky chose a shortcut he had used before: kerosene, a fuel that dissolved the sticky wax quickly but released flammable vapors on hot metal. That afternoon, the temperature was in the mid-90s, and investigators later measured sections of the slide above 140 degrees in direct sun. Confident the shortcut worked better than the usual method, Ricky carried rags and a small can of kerosene to the top platform and began pouring small amounts along the upper lanes. Within minutes, the smell of fuel grew stronger. Several workers noticed vapors settling low along the curved lanes of the slide. The shape acted like a shallow trough, allowing fumes to linger near the metal instead of dispersing into the air. Someone suggested stopping and waiting until evening when temperatures dropped. Ricky refused. He believed he could finish the job faster another way. Instead of wiping the lanes in sections, he folded a rag, soaked it heavily with kerosene, and sat down at the top of the slide. His plan was simple. He would slide down the lane once while sitting on the rag, using his body weight to press the fuel across the surface and clean the entire run in a single pass. Two workers stood at the bottom watching as he pushed off. Ricky began descending the lane on the kerosene-soaked cloth, accelerating as gravity carried him downward. Flames appeared along the kerosene-coated lane and reached the rag beneath him. Ricky tried to stand, but the slope carried him downward. Burning fuel spread from the cloth onto his clothing as he continued sliding. By the time he reached the bottom, his pants and shirt were burning. Workers ran toward him immediately. One grabbed a water hose used for dust control around the midway and sprayed him as he rolled across the gravel. The flames were extinguished within seconds. Emergency services were called, and paramedics arrived within 9 minutes. Ricky remained conscious, but had suffered severe burns across his thighs, lower back, and arms. He was airlifted to a regional burn center. Doctors treated extensive third-degree burns, covering roughly 40% of his body. The injuries caused massive fluid loss and severe damage to the underlying tissue. Despite airway support and aggressive treatment, his condition deteriorated. Ricky Mendez died 48 hours later from complications of thermal injuries. State inspectors determined that using a flammable fuel on overheated metal created a predictable ignition hazard. Investigators concluded that kerosene vapors had likely reached equipment operating near the base of the slide, where generators and electrical components were running for nearby attractions. The vapors ignited and flashed along the thin fuel layer coating the steel. The fare was cited and ordered to stop using fuel-based cleaners on ride surfaces. The following season, management switched to non-flammable degreasers and required temperature checks before maintenance work began. It was October 3, 2017, at a traveling fairground in Texas where the air felt warm and slightly humid, carrying the mix of food stands, dust, and machinery running non-stop. The ground was packed dirt, worn down by constant foot traffic, and the lights from the rides flickered against the darkening sky. Everything about the place felt temporary, assembled quickly, and expected to keep moving. Lyra Scoff was 24 years old, working freelance and building a visual portfolio centered around motion, specifically how things move under stress. She was drawn to the physics of it, the way force reveals itself in structure. That night, she was at the fair partly to enjoy it, but partly to study it. She had her camera, and she was looking. That detail matters more than it seems. She spent the early part of the evening observing rides before riding them. She watched how things moved, clocked the rhythm of cycles, noticed the way certain structures handled load. It was habit. She approached everything with that kind of attention. She eventually made her way to a chair swing near the center of the fairground, a rotating ride with suspended seats attached by chains, lifting riders outward as it gained speed. The structure stood about 40 feet tall, and at full operation, the chairs extended outward at a steep angle. She chose one of the outer seats, specifically for the arc. From that position, she'd told a friend earlier, you could feel the force at its maximum, the point where the chains were most taut, where the physics were most visible. It was exactly the kind of moment she was there to experience. The ride had been assembled earlier that week and had only undergone a standard visual inspection. One of the chain assemblies had been replaced earlier in the season, but the surrounding connectors had already been exposed to repeated stress over many cycles. The damage wasn't on the surface. It was inside the metal, in the structure of the link itself. As the ride began, it rotated slowly before building speed. Witnesses described a completely normal cycle. The chairs extended outward, reaching full arc as the force pulled them away from the center. At that point, the chains were under maximum tension. This is exactly the moment Lyra had chosen the outer seat to feel. Near the top of her chain assembly, a connector link weakened by repeated stress and minor corrosion reached its limit, not from anything unusual, but from exactly the force the ride was designed to generate. The load it had handled hundreds of times before. This time, the margin was gone. The link failed. Her chair detached and followed a straight outward path. Based on positioning and speed, she traveled approximately 35 to 45 feet beyond the ride's perimeter before striking a fixed metal barrier post and then the ground. The detached seat frame landed separately nearby. The ride continued spinning briefly before the operator noticed the missing chair and initiated a stop. There was no warning before it happened, no visible change, no sound, no shift in how the ride moved. The moment it failed was indistinguishable from every moment before it. She was pronounced dead at the scene from severe blunt force trauma. Inspection identified the failure point at the connector link. Progressive metal, fatigue, not sudden, built up over time, invisible at the surface, undetectable without testing that wasn't required and hadn't been done. The ride was shut down and removed for further examination, and additional scrutiny was placed on inspection procedures for similar equipment. She was looking at the right thing, just not from the right side of it. It was October 28th, 2018, at an indoor haunted ride in San Antonio, Texas. Most employees had already gone home for the night, leaving only a few security guards patrolling the property while automated maintenance systems ran their overnight routines. Enter Brandon Cruz. He was 18 years old, and like a lot of teens back then, he was convinced that one viral video could change his life overnight. And I get it, really do. His parents worked hard, his dad did overnight shifts loading trucks at a warehouse, and his mom cleaned local hotel rooms. But money was always tight. Brandon had spent years watching influencers turn a camera into a full-time career, and he wanted that for his family and himself. He worked part-time at an auto parts store after school and saved almost every single dollar to buy camera gear. His friends said he was super ambitious, energetic, and always brainstorming content. His phone was packed with notes, filming schedules, and lists of places he wanted to explore. To Brandon, success belonged to whoever was willing to do what nobody else would dare to do. That October, he started planning a new series about sneaking into places after hours and spending the night. This San Antonio haunted ride was supposed to be episode 1. It was huge inside, full of themed sets, tight backstage corridors, and hidden maintenance areas that regular guests never saw. So, Brandon and 3 of his friends bought tickets and walked into the park that afternoon just like normal guests. A few hours before closing time, they slipped behind some decorative scenery and hid out during the final security sweeps. And once the employees locked up and left, the group came out of hiding and started filming themselves exploring the dark, empty building. At first, they were just walking through empty hallways, checking out the ride equipment and filming under dim maintenance lights. But around 3:30 in the morning, Brandon saw a large decorative coffin-shaped prop sitting right next to the tracks. He thought it would make an awesome, dramatic jump scare for the video, so he climbed inside. His friends walked farther down the track to set up their cameras and catch his surprise entrance. But what Brandon didn't know was that the ride ran a daily automated maintenance cycle before the human maintenance crews arrived. Right around 4 o'clock in the morning, an empty ride vehicle entered the building as part of a routine system check. Unlike normal operating hours, it wasn't moving at ride speed. Security footage later showed the vehicle traveling at roughly 15 miles per hour while sensors and track systems were being tested. Unfortunately, the coffin prop Brandon was hiding in sat partially inside the train's clearance zone. Because the vehicle was moving quietly through a dark section of the attraction, and because the building's ventilation system created a constant background hum, neither Brandon nor his friends realized it was approaching. His friends later told investigators they never even heard the vehicle coming over the loud roar of the building's ventilation fans. And that detail alone keeps me up at night. No warning, no time to react, nothing. As the vehicle rounded a blind corner, it struck the coffin prop head-on. The impact wasn't dramatic enough to destroy the structure instantly, but it was powerful enough to shove the heavy prop several feet into a nearby support frame. Brandon was trapped between the moving vehicle, the prop, and the fixed structure. The ride safety system immediately detected the obstruction and automatically stopped the vehicle within seconds. But the crushing injuries had already been catastrophic. By the time Brandon's friends ran over, the train had stopped. One called emergency services while another ran for security. Paramedics got there in about 11 minutes, but Brandon was already gone. The medical examiner confirmed he died instantly from severe crush. Injuries to the chest, neck, and head caused by being pinned between multiple heavy structures. When investigators looked into it, they found the ride worked exactly the way it was programmed to. There were no mechanical failures. The official ruling was that it was a tragic accident caused by trespassing into a restricted zone. After the accident, the park added more overnight security and put up tougher barriers around backstage areas. But for Brandon's family, seeing those unfinished plans on his phone was the absolute hardest part. The video that was supposed to launch his dream channel ended up being the only thing people remembered him for. It was July 22, 2018 in Scottsdale, Arizona, and the desert heat that evening had barely let up. The kind of thick, dry air that makes neon light look almost liquid when it bounces off water. Behind a sprawling private estate on the eastern edge of the city, a full-scale water park was running at capacity. A private one, built by one woman for one purpose: to make sure that every person she invited never forgot where they spent their summer. Dorothy Skent was 48 years old, a self-made real estate developer who had spent 2 decades flipping luxury properties across the Southwest. She was sharp, decisive, and deeply competitive, not just professionally, but socially. People who knew her described someone who measured success in reactions. She didn't just want guests to have a good time. She wanted them to leave stunned. The water park behind her mansion was built on that instinct. Water slides, a lazy river, a swim-up bar, a surf machine, diving platforms, and at the center of it all, a custom-built infinity wave pool that used industrial-grade intake pumps to generate rolling artificial surf across the length of the pool. Weeks before the July party, one of the wave pool's protective intake grates, the heavy steel covers that sit flush against the pool floor and prevent the suction from grabbing anything it shouldn't, had cracked during routine maintenance. The grate was pulled. A replacement was on order. Staff understood the pool would run at reduced wave settings until the cover arrived. That was the plan. Dorothy had a different plan for party night. What if they had just stood their ground and refused to let Dorothy into the wave pool? Based on Dorothy's personality, I bet it might have caused an argument, maybe even ruined the mood for the day. The event was a neon-themed night session. Dozens of guests moved through the lit attractions while a DJ set echoed across the water. Underwater lights turned the wave pool into something that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover. Guests were filming constantly, synchronized dives, slow-motion footage, content for their platforms. Dorothy moved through it all with a waterproof camera, documenting everything herself. At some point during the evening, the wave intensity was increased. Witnesses confirmed she had pushed the settings higher for a more dramatic look on video. Dorothy entered the water and swam toward the strongest section near the infinity edge. She dove beneath the surface to capture underwater footage of the waves breaking above her. What happened next took seconds. As she descended, her swimsuit and upper thigh made contact with the exposed intake opening on the pool floor. The suction sealed her body against it almost instantly. She couldn't pull free. The pump pressure at elevated settings generated enough force to hold her pinned to the floor, regardless of how hard she pushed against it. From the surface, the situation wasn't immediately obvious. Her upper body remained partially visible beneath the churning water, and guests initially assumed she was holding her breath for the camera. By the time witnesses realized something was wrong, she had already been under far too long. One man dove in to pull her free. He surfaced without her. The suction was too strong to overcome by hand. I think this is the moment everything changed. If Dorothy had left the wave settings where staff originally kept them, there's a good chance none of this could happen to her. The emergency shutoff controls were located near the filtration system on the opposite end of the property. Staff ran through a crowded, active water park to reach them while guests screamed from the pool deck. The music kept playing. The waves kept rolling. By the time the pumps shut down and the suction released, Dorothy had been trapped underwater for several minutes. Guests pulled her free and began CPR near the pool deck. Paramedics pronounced her dead shortly after arriving. Investigators drained the wave pool and documented everything. The intake vent had been operating without its protective grate. The emergency shutoff was not accessible from the pool area. Party videos confirmed the wave intensity had been elevated that evening. Maintenance workers acknowledged the missing grate had been discussed before the event. The official findings were direct: an unguarded industrial intake vent running at elevated pump pressure on a private installation with no emergency access near the hazard. The exposed intake was later filled with concrete during partial demolition. The water park never operated again. It was October 19, 2017, at a large theme park in Williamsburg, Virginia, during a seasonal Halloween event. In the middle of a crowded scare zone transition, one guest stepped past a clearly marked boundary to get closer footage, and within seconds, a controlled performance turned into a fatal fall that no one could reverse in time. That night, Cheryl Motes, 50, a customer service supervisor, was at the park with co-workers after her shift, treating it as a casual outing. At work, she was used to stepping into complaints and pushing for answers, and that habit carried over into how she handled things in public. If something didn't match what she expected, she questioned it and kept pushing until she got the response she wanted. During one of the roaming scare segments, she positioned herself closer than most guests, watching the performers move through the area. Several of them were on stilts, standing roughly 4 feet off the ground, wearing extended creature costumes built on lightweight aluminum frames with foam outer shells. Cheryl began pointing things out to people nearby, insisting the figures weren't mechanical and describing what she believed were visible seams and movement patterns. As the segment ended, performers began moving through a roped-off side path meant strictly for staff and cast. Cheryl followed along the barrier with her phone raised, trying to get clearer footage. She called out to one of the performers, asking to see the costume up close and even try it on. A staff member told her no and directed her to stay behind the rope, but she didn't drop it. She repeated the request, raised her voice, and questioned why it wasn't allowed. Even as people around her began moving away, she stayed fixed on the performer. Instead, she leaned farther over the rope, trying to angle her phone upward. When that still wasn't enough, she stepped through a gap in the partially open rope line and entered the restricted pathway. At that moment, one of the performers, later identified as Ethan Caldwell, 27, a seasonal stilt actor, was moving through the exit route. He was elevated on drywall-style peg stilts, secured with leg straps and a waist harness. With a headpiece that limited his downward visibility, the costume extended his height further with a lightweight frame, making balance heavily dependent on controlled, predictable movement. Cheryl moved directly toward him, still filming. Staff immediately called out for her to step back, but she didn't. Instead, she closed the distance further, stepping into his path just as he began to pivot toward the exit corridor. The sudden obstruction forced an immediate adjustment. With limited visibility and no space to move around her, Caldwell shifted his weight to compensate. It wasn't enough. His right stilt came down slightly off-angle near the edge of the walkway. With his balance already compromised mid-turn and the added height of the costume frame, the correction failed. The structure amplified the instability instead of absorbing it. He went forward. Directly ahead, along the edge of the pathway, were decorative Halloween props. Jagged, spike-like elements rising at uneven angles from a low base, set as a visual barrier between the path and the themed area. The fall was uncontrolled. From several feet up, his upper body pitched forward first. With his arms restricted inside the costume frame, he couldn't break the fall. His momentum carried him down hard onto the ground and the concealed base structure beneath the display. The impact hit across his upper chest and side at once. The force, combined with his height, drove him into the rigid edge of the base before the costume frame collapsed over him, pinning him briefly. The sound changed everything. At first, the crowd didn't react. Then, people nearby stepped back abruptly. He wasn't moving. Witnesses rushed in immediately, lifting sections of the costume and pulling him clear. Caldwell was conscious, disoriented, and in visible pain, but responsive as medical staff stabilized him. Cheryl, who had been standing directly in front of him, didn't have time to move when he came down. The forward momentum carried part of the collapsing frame into her, knocking her backward onto the hard walkway surface. She struck the ground with force, her head and upper body taking the impact. She went down immediately. Staff redirected attention as the situation escalated. Cheryl was unresponsive, with heavy bleeding and no reaction to verbal commands. The park's on-site medical team arrived within minutes and began emergency intervention. but the extent of the injury was severe. Emergency medical services transported both of them to a nearby hospital. Caldwell was treated for multiple blunt force injuries and fractures and later stabilized. Cheryl, however, was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The cause of death was determined to be severe blunt force trauma to the head and upper body, resulting in critical internal injuries.
It was August 3, 2016, in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, where a zipline course ran across a wooded hillside just outside the main tourist strip. From a distance, everything looked controlled. Staff at each platform, riders sent one at a time, but the entire system depended on one thing. Every connection had to be checked correctly. Just before her turn, Karen Doyle, 44, stood near the front of the platform. She worked in real estate, a job built on negotiation and control, and that mindset carried into small moments like this. Years earlier, she had spent time at an indoor climbing gym. Not recently, but enough to feel familiar with harnesses and gear. And I've seen that pattern before. Just enough experience to feel like you already understand the system, which is usually where people start skipping parts that matter most. The setup was straightforward. The harness secured around the waist and legs, with a reinforced front loop designed to hold full body weight. That was the only correct attachment point for the carabiner connected to the zipline trolley. There were also side gear loops, which looked similar but were thinner and more flexible, meant to carry small items, not a person. If you weren't paying close attention, they could look close enough to pass. As the guide moved down the line, each rider received the same hands-on check, physically confirming the carabiner was clipped to the correct loop before allowing them forward. When the guide reached Karen, they leaned in to inspect her connection point. She stopped them mid-check. She told them she had already clipped it and gestured toward the carabiner, keeping her hand close to it. The guide explained they still needed to verify it physically. She didn't step aside. Instead, she shifted her body just enough to keep the front of the harness out of reach, repeating that it was already set. At the same time, the platform behind her was filling. The line tightened. The next group was already being staged, and another guide called out to keep dispatch moving. There was a brief pause. From the guide's position, the carabiner was visible and appeared attached. With pressure building to move the line, the check was treated as already completed. From the outside, everything still looked correct. The harness was on properly, the carabiner appeared clipped, and nothing stood out, but it was attached to the wrong point. Instead of the reinforced front loop, the carabiner had been clipped into a side gear loop that wasn't designed to support body weight. When her turn came, she stepped forward to the edge of the platform. The cable stretched out ahead, sloping downward toward the next station, with trees and uneven ground below. She leaned forward and stepped off, and for a fraction of a second, everything felt normal. Then the load transferred. The gear loop tore instantly under her full weight. There was no warning, no stretching, just immediate failure. The system did exactly what it was supposed to do, but the load was placed on a point that couldn't handle it. Instead of gliding forward, she dropped down the slope below the platform. The fall carried her roughly 50 to 60 feet through branches, rock, and uneven terrain. Her body struck multiple surfaces on the way down, altering her path but not reducing the force of impact. People on the platform heard the tear before they understood what had happened, followed by sudden movement below the tree line. When they looked back, the line above was already swinging empty. And this is what got me when I was going through the reports on this. Nothing starts as a big mistake. It's always something small. The kind of thing that probably happens all the time without consequences. But in this case, that one step was the whole system. Once it's skipped, everything after it just plays out exactly as designed. Staff responded immediately, moving down the slope as quickly as the terrain allowed, while emergency services were called. It took several minutes to reach her due to dense vegetation and uneven ground. By the time responders arrived, the injuries were already severe. Multiple blunt force trauma consistent with a high fall. She was transported, but did not survive. The investigation focused on the harness and connection point. The torn gear loop was recovered with the carabiner still attached, and the harness showed no defects. Staff confirmed the safety check had been interrupted and not fully completed. She had been told they needed to check, but she stopped it. Afterward, protocols were updated to require full, hands-on verification before every launch. Witnesses said everything had looked normal until it suddenly went quiet. It really just comes down to that moment.
It was June 2nd, 2017, in Anaheim, California. Inside the Sleeping Beauty Castle walkthrough, the space was tight and dim, with guests moving in a slow, steady line past glass displays. Everything about it was controlled: low ceilings, narrow paths, and constant flow. Nothing about it felt like a place where anything serious could happen. Eric Dalton, 29, had been in the park since late morning, moving from ride to ride without much of a break. He worked freelance jobs, the kind that came and went, and when something didn't meet expectations, it stuck with him longer than it should. By the time he reached the castle, that feeling had already built up. The walkthrough wasn't what he expected. No open towers, no wide views, just enclosed scenes behind glass, people passing through quickly, barely stopping. It felt more like a hallway than a castle. He kept moving, but the disappointment didn't go away. Halfway through, the path opened slightly into a small balcony area overlooking a lower section of the walkway. It wasn't meant for guests. A rope barrier and a small sign marked it for staff only. Most people didn't even look at it. They just kept moving with the line. Eric didn't. He stepped over the rope without hesitation, the same way people ignore small barriers when they don't feel serious. The space didn't offer much, just a slightly higher view of the same narrow path. But along the edge was a low, decorative ledge, built to look like part of the castle wall. It looked solid, stable, like something you could lean on. He walked up to it and rested his hand on top. It didn't move. No warning, no shift in weight, just a firm surface that felt real enough. Instead of stepping back, he turned and leaned his weight onto it, like someone taking a quick seat or bracing themselves for a better view. The balance wasn't there. The ledge wasn't designed to support that kind of weight, and the top surface had less grip than it looked. His center of gravity shifted past the edge, and without anything to catch himself on, his body tipped forward. From the level below, people saw it happen in a split second. One moment he was above them, just outside the normal path. The next, he dropped over the edge and hit the lower walkway hard. The sound cut through the space, sharp, immediate. Movement stopped. People turned, but for a second, no one reacted. It didn't register right away what had just happened. Staff reached the area quickly and cleared the walkway as emergency services were called. He was unresponsive when they got to him. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but the impact had already caused critical injuries. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later confirmed the cause of death as severe blunt force trauma from a fall, consistent with losing balance from an elevated position and landing directly onto a hard surface below. Investigators reviewed the area and found no structural failure. The barrier had been in place, clearly marking the section as restricted. The ledge itself was decorative, stable enough to appear real, but not intended for use, and not designed to support body weight or provide secure footing. And when you look at it like that, the decision itself was simple: stepping over a barrier and using something that wasn't meant to be used, or force anything open. He just assumed it was safe and acted on it. And I keep thinking about that because it's the kind of thing you see all the time. People testing something quickly and trusting it right after. But where do you even draw the line? It was May 27th, 2018. At a large lakeside amusement park in Ohio, the evening air cooled as lines tightened around a steel coaster. The lift chain pulled steadily uphill, restraints locked, and phone screens lit faces in fading light. The posted safety rules stood beside the queue entrance. Beneath the platform lights, Marissa Hale, 24, was trying to build a small YouTube presence, posting short ride clips and park visits online. Friends said she rarely went anywhere without filming or taking photos to upload later. That evening, the lift and front row were operating under normal procedures, with standard restraints in place and posted rules clearly visible. The train climbed 310 feet with a lap bar and rider-fastened seatbelt in place. Marissa chose the front row for a lift hill photo, ignoring posted warnings to secure loose items. As the train moved slowly upward, she lifted her phone again, adjusting it repeatedly as if trying to capture a better angle while the structure rose behind her. A breeze moved across the structure as the train rose above the midway. Near the upper third of the lift, her phone slipped from her hand, bounced once, and slid forward along the smooth fiberglass floor toward the front cowling. Riders behind her later said they saw her shoulders dip as she leaned down to reach for it. Waiting until the train returned to the station would have meant losing immediate access to the phone. Marissa reached farther and unbuckled her seatbelt, which is rider-controlled and not electronically monitored on that model. The lap bar remained lowered, but her hips lifted partially off the seat and her weight shifted forward. She braced one foot against the floor and extended her arm again. The chain continued pulling the train upward, link by link. As she stretched, her shoe lost traction on the smooth surface. Without her hips fully positioned beneath the lap restraint, her body slid forward more than the restraint was designed to allow. She attempted to lower herself back into position, but she remained partially raised as the train approached the crest. At the top, the track leveled briefly and then angled downward into the first drop. Riders felt the expected moment of reduced weight as gravity began to pull the train over. Because she was not fully seated, her torso continued moving forward and cleared the front cowling. Two riders in the second row later reported seeing her upper body move beyond the front edge just before the drop transition. She fell from near the crest, approximately 250 to 300 feet above ground level, consistent with the ride's height. The initial impact occurred against a steel support beam, which changed her direction and reduced some forward momentum. She then struck a graded maintenance platform below. Witnesses on the midway described a heavy impact, followed by immediate stillness. The operator initiated an emergency stop once alerted, and Park Communications contacted emergency services immediately. On-site medical personnel reached the base of the structure within minutes, with paramedics arriving shortly after. She was found unresponsive with catastrophic trauma and no detectable pulse. Resuscitation was not initiated due to injuries incompatible with survival. The post-mortem examination documented injuries consistent with a high-energy fall involving multiple impacts. There were extensive skull fractures and fractures to the cervical spine. Both lungs were severely contused and lacerated. The aorta, the main artery leaving the heart, was torn, leading to rapid internal blood loss. The cause of death was ruled massive internal hemorrhage from blunt force trauma. After the incident, the area was secured and reviewed. Operational findings determined that the lap restraint functioned as designed for a fully seated rider and that the seatbelt had been unbuckled during ascent. Mechanical inspection found no equipment failure. In the weeks that followed, additional lift hill reminders were added and staff monitoring for unusual rider movement was increased to reduce the risk of similar behavior. After a split-second decision at the crest, it was August 12, 2015, at a coastal amusement pier in New Jersey, where the air carried salt, humidity, and the constant hum of rides running one after another. The wooden planks beneath the attractions felt slightly damp from the ocean air, and the overhead lighting reflected faintly off surfaces that never fully dried. Even at night, the place stayed active, with rides cycling continuously and very little downtime between groups. Braden Glass was 21 years old, working a physically demanding job and visiting the pier with friends. From what was later shared, he documented everything, often recording clips rather than just watching. He wasn't focused on any one ride, just moving around and taking in the atmosphere. Eventually, they made their way to a bumper car attraction near the center of the pier. It was a covered setup with an overhead electric grid where each car connected through a vertical pole that maintained contact with the power source above. The system relied on consistent electrical flow to keep the cars moving. Earlier that evening, staff had noticed flickering in one section of the grid. This wasn't just a brief interruption. There were repeated surges where the current didn't fully drop, suggesting the system stayed partially energized instead of cycling cleanly off. It was subtle and inconsistent, not enough to stop operation, so the ride continued without a full shutdown. I've gone back to that detail more than once. A flicker noted, a ride still running. The kind of issue that doesn't look urgent, especially when everything at ground level still appears normal. And this is the point where the problem stops being hidden. During the ride cycle, a fault developed in the overhead grid. Witnesses described brief flashes above the cars, consistent with electrical arcing. What wasn't visible from below was that part of the system wasn't de-energizing. Sections of the grid remained live, unstable, and carrying sustained current instead of shutting down as designed. As the ride continued, several cars, including the one Braden was in, slowed and stopped beneath the affected section. Riders began stepping out once their cars stalled. That's a normal reaction when a ride loses power. From where they stood, nothing suggested the system above them was still active. No alarms, no visible warning, just stalled cars and a routine inconvenience. Braden stepped onto the slightly damp floor. As he moved away, he placed a hand on the metal frame of the car to steady himself, maintaining contact as his feet shifted across the surface. At that point, a live current traveled from the compromised grid through the contact pole into the car, and with the damp floor completing the circuit, it passed through his body. The reaction wasn't instant collapse. His body locked for a moment, muscles tightening as the current held him in place, preventing him from letting go before he dropped. Witnesses reported seeing him collapse near the car while sparks continued briefly overhead. Others began moving away as the situation became clear. The part that stays with me is how calm everything felt before it happened. People stepping off stalled cars, going through the motions of an ordinary inconvenience. Nobody had a reason to think otherwise. Staff cut power shortly after recognizing the fault, but the delay mattered. The system remained energized longer than it should have, allowing current to continue flowing even after the ride appeared inactive. In situations involving electricity, even a short delay can make a critical difference. Braden was unresponsive when responders reached him. He was later pronounced dead at the scene, with the cause determined to be electrocution. Several others were treated for minor electrical exposure. Inspection revealed that the instability in the overhead grid allowed unintended current to travel through multiple conductive points. Investigators concluded that moisture on the floor, combined with the electrical fault and delayed shutdown, created the conditions for the incident. Additional grounding measures and faster emergency shutoff protocols were recommended after. This one changed how I look at places like that. Now, I notice things. The damp floors, the hum overhead, the small signs that something might not be right. Braden's case is a reminder of what happens when several small things line up at once. It was October 14th, 2017, in Taney County, Missouri, and the air around Hollow Creek Park already felt strange long before police entered the property. The temperature had dropped into the low 50s that night, and fog from nearby woods mixed with artificial smoke drifting through the midway from the park's Halloween attractions. The owner of the park was Kenneth Vrax, a 51-year-old businessman who reportedly owned multiple waterfront homes, traveled in a private jet leased through one of his companies, and spent years buying failing properties across the Midwest before reopening them as high-profit entertainment ventures. Kenneth purchased a Hollow Creek Park after it had been abandoned for years following storm damage and financial losses. Instead of fully restoring it, he reopened only parts of the property for private events and Halloween weekends. Large sections of the park stayed closed off. Former employees later told investigators that Kenneth rarely allowed workers near the rear maintenance garages or underground service corridors. Those tunnels had originally been built decades earlier for plumbing and electrical access, but over time, they became one of the most suspicious parts of the property after newer locks and surveillance cameras appeared around entrances that employees were told were abandoned. As I see it, the more someone tries to cover something up, the more it sticks out. Locks, cameras, and off-limits signs only make people wonder more. In the weeks leading up to the incident, investigators had already started watching the park after receiving information from a former worker about illegal activity connected to backstage areas. Surveillance teams reportedly observed delivery vans entering through rear service roads late at night while guards patrolled sections of the property after guests had gone home. But on the night of October 14th, the park was crowded with Halloween visitors. Families moved through haunted attractions while actors walked between fog machines and flashing lights. Because the event already used fake emergency effects as part of the show, many guests initially thought the arriving officers were performers. According to witness videos, confusion spread quickly once deputies started forcing people toward the exits with rifles drawn. Some guests continued filming because they still believed the raid was part of the attraction. Kenneth was reportedly inside a maintenance garage near the old carousel building with 2 security guards when officers entered the backstage area. Investigators later said the 3 men fled through an employee hallway connected to the underground utility tunnels beneath the park. The tunnels were narrow concrete corridors lined with exposed pipes and drainage channels. Officers moving through the passageways later reported hearing gunfire deeper inside the tunnel system. During the exchange, A bullet struck an overhead water pipe, causing water to spray across the floor and down a nearby maintenance shaft. One of the guards surrendered near a tunnel junction, but Kenneth continued deeper underground before climbing a fixed steel ladder leading toward an emergency hatch 18 feet above the tunnel floor. Investigators later concluded that water from the damaged pipe had spread across the ladder rungs. Kenneth was also carrying a short rifle attached to a shoulder sling while climbing upward. Near the upper section of the shaft, he apparently slipped on the wet ladder as the rifle shifted sideways against his body. He fell backward the entire distance down the shaft and struck the concrete floor below. The back of his head impacted the raised steel edge of a drainage channel running along the tunnel floor. Deputies reaching the bottom reported catastrophic head injuries and no meaningful movement after the fall. Kenneth Vrax was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Authorities later confirmed he died from blunt force trauma sustained during the fall. Investigators spent the following days searching backstage buildings and underground corridors throughout the property. Several employees and guards were arrested on weapons and obstruction charges, while detectives also confirmed hidden maintenance rooms had been converted into makeshift overnight living spaces. It was June 28, 2014, at a regional water park just outside San Marcos, Texas. A woman had just been turned away from a ride over a rule that wasn't negotiable. At first, it looked like a routine argument, but within minutes, she found another way in. And this time, she didn't go through it alone. One of the visitors that day was Barb Onifer, 61 years old, a retired bookkeeper who had spent years working around routines and structured systems. She was at the park with her daughter and grandson as part of a weekend family outing, something they had planned as a simple way to spend time together. She was used to rules, but also to questioning them when they didn't make sense to her. That afternoon, she got in line for one of the park's enclosed body slides, designed strictly for single riders with a clearly posted weight limit. When she reached the front, the attendant stopped her and explained she exceeded the limit. The rule wasn't flexible, but Barb argued. She questioned how the limit was determined, whether it was being applied fairly, and why others seemed to be allowed through. The exchange went on long enough to draw attention from people nearby. Eventually, the attendant held firm, and she was asked to step aside, but she didn't leave. She stayed near the platform, watching the line. After a shift change, a new attendant took over, someone who hadn't been part of the earlier interaction. As the line moved again, Barb stepped forward without mentioning what had happened before. I'll be honest, this always stands out to me. I've seen people wait for a staff change like it resets everything, like what just happened doesn't count anymore. This time, she was waved through. At the dispatch point, she was instructed to wait for the signal and go one at a time. But as the previous rider cleared the slide, Barb moved ahead early, entering the launch position before the attendant gave the next dispatch cue. Behind her was another guest, a teenage boy later identified as Rohan Lee, 16, who had been waiting for his turn. From his position, it appeared the cycle had reset, and Barb's movement signaled the next dispatch. As Barb pushed off into the slide without authorization, Rohan followed just seconds after, believing it was his turn before proper spacing had been re-established. Inside the enclosed tube, that spacing mattered. The slide was designed so each rider had enough distance for water flow to regulate speed. With two riders too close together, and with Barb exceeding the intended weight, the balance was disrupted. Barb accelerated faster than expected, while Rohan, entering just behind her, began gaining on her through the turns. People waiting near the exit later said they could hear the difference. Instead of the usual steady rush of water, there were irregular, heavier impacts echoing through the tube, two bodies moving through sections too close together. Inside, neither of them had visibility or control over the distance between them. By the final section, Rohan had nearly closed the gap. Barb exited the slide first, but still carrying more speed than intended. The run-out channel, designed to slow riders gradually, began reducing her speed, but not enough to create safe separation before the next rider arrived. Seconds later, Rohan shot out of the exit behind her. He collided directly into her back at speed. The impact drove both of them forward through the shallow run-out channel and into the end barrier. While the barrier was padded, it was mounted over a rigid support. Barb was forced into it with combined momentum, her body compressed between the structure and the force of Rohan's impact from behind. Lifeguards stationed at the exit reacted immediately. They entered the water within seconds and pulled both riders clear. Barb was unresponsive. Rohan was conscious but disoriented, showing signs of head impact and breathing difficulty. Emergency services were called immediately. On-site medical staff began resuscitation efforts on Barb while stabilizing Rohan. Both were transported to a nearby hospital. Barb Onifer, 61, was pronounced dead shortly after arrival due to severe blunt force trauma to the chest and head, consistent with high force compression against a fixed structure. Rohan Lee survived with a concussion, rib bruising, and minor fractures. In the investigation that followed, the ride was found to be operating within normal parameters. There were no mechanical failures. The weight limits and rider spacing rules were critical to maintaining safe speeds and preventing collisions inside the slide.
It was May 29, 2014, in Orlando, Florida, and the water park was already at full capacity, with lines packed tightly across every attraction. From the outside, the large funnel-style slide looked smooth and controlled, with riders entering at steady intervals. But inside, the system depended on balance, timing, and uninterrupted flow to function safely. At the front of the line, Sharon Pike, 46, had already spent hours in the heat. She worked in sales, where she was used to pushing through delays instead of waiting. She came with her sister's family to take a break from work, but by then, the waiting was already getting to her. The ride used two-person inflatable tubes as part of its design. The combined weight kept the raft stable through the enclosed sections. At the gate, attendants stopped her and told her she needed a second rider before dispatch. She didn't step back. She told them she didn't want to wait and that she'd just go alone. The attendant repeated it. 2 riders only. There was a pause. The line behind her tightened, people shifting forward, and another group was already being staged. She stayed at the gate instead of moving aside, holding her position. A second attendant stepped in, trying to pair her quickly with another rider, but she waved it off and kept her hands on the tube, already angled toward the entry. And this is where it shifts, because the warning wasn't missed. It was given clearly, twice. When the gate opened for the next dispatch, she moved forward with it before the staff could stop her, entering the slide alone. Seconds later, the next raft entered and collided with her at speed. That single impact was enough to cause fatal injuries inside the confined section. At first, everything appeared normal. The raft dropped into the enclosed section and the water pulled it forward. But almost immediately, the missing weight changed how it responded to the current. Within seconds, it began to wobble. As it moved through the first curve, the front lifted slightly while the rear dipped, shifting the center of gravity. That shift caused the raft to rotate off-center, placing it at an angle against the flow. And this is where everything starts to come apart. The raft tipped, and she was thrown partially out, losing her seated position as the water carried both her and the tube forward. Instead of staying aligned with the current, her body turned sideways as she entered the next curve. Her speed dropped. The water kept pushing, but she was no longer moving with it. She wasn't fully pinned, but she wasn't clear either, caught in a position that disrupted the flow just enough to slow her down. Seconds later, the next raft was released. The rider behind had no warning. No visibility inside the enclosed section. No way to stop. The raft caught up and collided with her at speed. The impact forced her further into the curve, pushing her into the slide wall before continuing forward. By the time operators noticed the delay between dispatch and exit times, the damage had already been done. And this is the part people don't think about. The ride doesn't recognize something like this right away. It keeps running until someone stops it. Operators initiated a manual shutdown after noticing irregular timing and reports from riders exiting the slide. Staff entered through an access point and located her inside the enclosed section. She was unresponsive. Emergency responders arrived shortly after, but the injuries were already severe. The medical examiner later confirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma, consistent with a high-speed impact inside the slide. The investigation confirmed the sequence. A single rider entered a 2-person raft, leading to instability, partial ejection, loss of alignment, and a collision with the following rider. No mechanical failure was found. The system operated as designed. What stands out is how normal it begins. I've seen people ignore small ride rules like this all the time, assuming nothing serious will happen, and most of the time, nothing does, until one time it does. After the incident, procedures were updated to strictly prevent single riders from using multi-person rafts under any circumstances, removing any possibility of imbalance at dispatch, because in the end, nothing broke.
It was September 11, 2015, at the loading area of a slow-moving boat ride in Anaheim, California, and from where most people stood, it looked like a calm, routine moment as boats drifted in a steady line along a concealed track, sliding past each other with small, consistent gaps between them. The movement was predictable, controlled, and quiet enough that nothing about it felt urgent. Daniel Reeves, 31, sat midway through the ride, shifting slightly in his seat as the same looping song continued around him. And what stood out about him wasn't anything unusual at first, just that he had reached a point where he didn't want to be there anymore. He worked long hours in logistics, was used to solving problems quickly, and when something felt off, he didn't like waiting for someone else to fix it. I've seen that kind of reaction before. And if I'm being honest, I understand it. Because when something feels simple, you convince yourself there's an easy way out, even when you're not supposed to create one. As the boat moved forward, Daniel leaned slightly toward the edge, looking past the row of identical boats ahead of him toward the loading dock in the distance. And instead of waiting for the ride to finish or signaling a staff member, he focused on the small gaps between the boats as they moved. Those gaps between the boats were narrow, consistent, and never meant for anything to enter, because the entire system depended on fixed spacing and continuous motion that didn't account for interruption. The boats themselves were made of rigid fiberglass, heavy enough to hold their alignment as they followed the track. And although they moved slowly, they were not designed to stop on demand unless the entire ride was shut down, which meant the spacing, timing, and movement all remained constant regardless of what happened inside that space. Daniel shifted forward in his seat and then stood up, drawing a few glances from nearby riders who noticed the movement but didn't react immediately, since it didn't look urgent at first, just someone adjusting position in a slow-moving ride where nothing seemed to escalate quickly. That hesitation allowed him to continue, because without an obvious sign of danger, no one stepped in. He stepped onto the edge of his boat and tested his balance briefly before shifting his weight forward and attempting to step across to the next one as it moved alongside. The movement was unstable, his footing uncertain, but he managed to stay upright just long enough to keep going. That initial success mattered because it likely removed any hesitation and replaced it with confidence. He moved again, attempting to cross another gap as the boats continued their steady motion toward the loading area. But this time, the spacing wasn't aligned the same way, and that small difference was enough to change everything. As he pushed off, the next boat drifted just out of position, and instead of landing securely, his foot dropped into the narrow space between the two hulls, where it became pinned as the boats continued moving forward, the pressure building as the gap tightened around it. At first, it didn't appear serious because there was no immediate collapse or violent reaction, just a delayed realization that his foot wasn't coming back up. He tried to pull it free, but the grip held firmly, and the same traction in his boot that normally gave him stability now worked against him, locking it in place between two solid surfaces that continued to move without stopping. As the system carried the boats forward, his leg remained pinned, and his balance gave out as his upper body pitched forward, leaving him reaching for support that didn't exist because everything around him was moving at the same controlled pace. People nearby began to notice the shift, but by the time the urgency became clear, he had already lost the ability to recover. The motion of the ride kept his leg locked in place as his body dropped awkwardly against the edge of the boat and surrounding structure, limiting his ability to pull himself up or reposition. Although a ride operator was alerted and initiated a stop, the system slowed gradually rather than instantly, and those few seconds allowed the situation to worsen beyond recovery. By the time the ride came to a full stop, his leg remained trapped while his upper body had been forced into a compressed position against the boat and surrounding structure, restricting his ability to breathe or free himself. Staff reached him quickly and attempted to release the pressure, but the positioning required careful handling before he could be freed. Paramedics arrived within minutes and took over, but there was no effective breathing and no sustained pulse, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later confirmed the cause of death as asphyxia associated with entrapment, meaning his leg became pinned and his body was forced into a position where his chest could not expand properly, leading to rapid loss of consciousness. It was April 21st, 2017. A river rapids ride operated at full capacity on a crowded spring Friday filled with school groups in Virginia. Circular rafts drifted toward the unload conveyor in tight clusters as water surged through the channel. Attendants repeated seating instructions each cycle while the line continued moving. In that crowded raft was Tyler Boone, 17, a junior at a public high school outside Richmond. He was loud in class, quick with jokes, and played junior varsity baseball. On weekends, he collected carts at a grocery store. He was not known as reckless, but he avoided looking cautious in front of classmates, especially on field trips where attention shifted fast. Earlier that day, he had kept friends entertained in long lines with small stunts and exaggerated reactions. That afternoon, the ride backed up with school groups. Rafts bumped as they drifted toward the unload platform. Attendants signaled for everyone to remain seated. Tyler stood anyway as his raft slowed near the platform. Instead of sitting back down, he stepped onto the inflated collar of the raft beside his, testing his balance while the two boats drifted inches apart. Witnesses later said it looked like he was trying to step from one raft to the next as they floated toward the unload belt. Once loaded, each circular raft weighed close to 1,000 pounds. Beneath the water, a moving belt guided them into position while the current pushed from behind, causing rafts to press together as they stacked up. Tyler stepped back when the spacing shifted, then tried again as the current nudged the boats unevenly. The front raft had already engaged with the moving belt, while the one behind drifted at a slight angle. The gap between them widened and narrowed by inches over a few seconds. Attendants focused on aligning the lead raft, not yet seeing Tyler's movement between the two. On his third attempt, Tyler placed his right foot toward the adjacent collar just as the rafts began drifting back together. His foot slipped between the inflated tubes, the rubber compressed inward. His lower leg dropped until his calf pressed against the rigid inner ring. The conveyor continued pulling the front raft forward while the current pushed the rear raft from behind. The combined force pinned his leg in the narrowing space. Witnesses heard him scream over the rushing water as the rafts compressed together for several seconds, trapping his leg between them. The force caused severe injuries to his lower leg. When the rafts finally shifted apart, he lost balance and fell into the channel, striking his head against the fiberglass wall before slipping partly underwater in the churning flow. The ride was stopped within seconds and emergency services were called. Staff entered the channel as the water level dropped. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found Tyler unresponsive with severe bleeding from his leg. Despite rapid treatment, the blood loss was extensive, and he went into cardiac arrest before transport. The medical examiner documented a torn popliteal artery and vein, multiple lower leg fractures, and blunt head trauma from impact with the flume wall. The head injury was not independently fatal. The cause of death was ruled rapid blood loss following compression between two rafts. The park's internal review confirmed the ride operated within normal mechanical limits and that no equipment failure occurred. Physical divider fins were later installed in the unload channel to limit raft overlap and reduce pinch points, and additional attendants were assigned during high-volume school days. Tyler's school revised its field trip policies and required safety briefings before ride entry. His name was included in presentations about peer pressure and rule compliance. The ride reopened after inspection and continued operating under standard procedures. One moment he was showing off between drifting rafts, the next, the water turned violent. It was May 27, 2018, at a regional theme park in Florida where the heat lingered even into the evening and the air felt thick with humidity. The constant movement of people kept the area around the rides crowded and active. Music, mechanical noise, and overlapping conversations blended into a steady background that never really stopped. Miley Troff was 17 years old, visiting the park as part of a school group. She was the kind of person who made herself easy to be around. Agreeable, low maintenance, never the one to slow things down. When the group moved, she moved. When they picked a ride, she got in line. That willingness to just go along had probably served her fine every other day of her life. That night it didn't. They made their way to a spinning ride near the center of the park, a cylindrical structure that pressed riders against padded walls using rotational force. Once it reached full speed, the centrifugal pressure was what held everyone in place. The restraint system was basic. The ride did most of the work. The The ride had been running continuously since the park opened. One of the restraint sensors had triggered intermittent warnings earlier in the day, but the ride hadn't been shut down. As attendants climbed through the afternoon, loading procedures grew faster and less deliberate. The rhythm of a busy day had taken over. That detail kept pulling me back. It's not that anyone decided to cut corners, it's that the pace became the decision and nobody stepped outside of it long enough to notice. During loading, a staff member checked restraints. Miley's was noted and the cycle was cleared to begin. Nothing appeared unusual. She took her position against the wall and the ride started. But her restraint hadn't fully engaged, not visibly loose, not obviously wrong. Just not quite locked into the position it needed to be. As the ride built speed, the force pressed riders into the wall as expected. For most of them, it held. For Miley, the slight gap meant her body wasn't anchored the same way. As rotation fluctuated slightly, she began to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly, downward along the wall. She felt it happening. People on the ride noticed her position changing, but didn't immediately understand what they were seeing. From the outside, it wasn't readable yet. A warning indicator activated on the operator's panel, but that same indicator had flagged earlier and resolved on its own. The operator waited to see if it would clear again. It didn't. She slid below the point where rotational force could hold her properly. Her lower body drifted toward the seam where the rotating floor met the vertical surface, a pinch point not intended for rider contact during normal operation. Once contact was made, the motion of the floor took over, and the ride was still spinning. A second staff member spotted the situation and called for a stop. The operator responded immediately, but at that speed, the braking system needed time. Several more seconds passed. By the time the ride stopped, the damage had already occurred. She was transported for emergency care, but later died from severe crush injuries. Internal review confirmed the restraint had not been fully secured. The warning indicator had been active before the stop. The rushed loading, the ignored sensor, the delayed response, none of it alone caused what happened. All of it together did. It's one thing to trust a system as a rider, but it's different when you're part of the system itself. It was July 14, 2015 in Orlando, Florida. At a crowded water park, a woman refused to leave a ride exit, insisting she shouldn't have to wait again. It didn't seem serious at first, but within minutes, her decision pulled someone else into a space designed to move without stopping. Donna Pelchat was 52, working as a tour coordinator. That day, she was at the park with her husband and a visiting family friend, someone she had personally invited because she wanted everything to go smoothly. That was kind of her thing. She liked being in control of plans, keeping things on track, making sure nothing slowed them down. And when something didn't match what she expected, she didn't just let it go. She stepped in and tried to fix it herself. After finishing a log flume ride, she didn't follow the marked exit like everyone else. Instead, she stayed near the unloading platform and told the operator she shouldn't have to go through the full line again. She pointed to a separate access point she had noticed earlier and insisted she should be allowed through that way. Staff told her clearly to move along, but she stayed right where she was. And honestly, most people understand those priority lines are there for guests who truly need them, which makes it surprising she tried to use that as an excuse. As the next boat approached the unload area, operators shifted their attention to the incoming riders. In that short gap, Donna stepped past a waist-high barrier and slipped through a side service gate that hadn't fully latched. Behind it was a narrow maintenance walkway running alongside the runout channel. Wet, uneven, and clearly not meant for guests. Her husband followed right behind her as staff started shouting for both of them to come back, but Donna kept going along the narrow edge, saying they'd just get on from there instead of going all the way around again. He stayed close, reaching toward her like he was trying to steady her because the ground under them was getting slick from the constant water flow. By then, the next log had already gone over the drop and entered the runout channel. And that's the part people don't realize. Once a ride like that is moving, it doesn't just stop on command. The boat came in fast along the guided track, water pushing out around it as it started to slow, but not nearly fast enough. As Donna kept moving forward on the slippery edge, her foot suddenly slid out from under her, and she fell sideways straight into the channel. Her husband reacted instantly, reaching to grab her, but instead of pulling her back, the motion threw him off balance too, and he went in right after her, just seconds before the boat reached them. There was nowhere for it to go. The front of the log pressed both of them into the concrete sidewall, pinning them in place as the water surged around them. It wasn't some dramatic impact. It was tight, mechanical, and unforgiving. From the platform, it happened fast, but not fast enough to miss what was happening. Operators hit the emergency stop the moment they saw them, but the ride still needed distance to come to a full stop. By the time it did, both of them were trapped in the channel. Staff and lifeguards rushed in immediately, getting into the water to free them. It took time to shift the boat enough to pull them out from the sidewall. By the time they were brought back onto the platform, neither of them was responding. CPR was started right there as emergency responders were called in, but despite continued efforts, both were later pronounced dead. The findings pointed to crushing injuries to the chest, along with drowning, which lines up with being pinned underwater in an active ride channel. The investigation later confirmed that the ride itself was working exactly as it should. The boat stayed on its track, and staff followed emergency procedures. Everything came back to that one decision: Donna stepping into a restricted area and her husband following right behind her.
It was October 11th, 2018, in Valencia, California. The park moved in its usual rhythm, lines advancing, gates opening, platforms resetting in steady cycles. From a distance, everything looked predictable, but that predictability depended on one condition. Guests stayed behind clearly marked boundaries. Earlier that afternoon, Diane Kessler, 52, had been moving through the park differently than most guests. She owned a cosmetics business where control and timing shaped how she handled situations, and that carried over into how she dealt with delays. She was at the park with clients after a slow stretch in business, and VIP access had worked in her favor all day. With shorter lines and fewer restrictions, the rules started to feel flexible. The ride used a sliding platform system that shifted sideways during each reset cycle, briefly opening a narrow gap between the platform and the fixed edge. That space was meant to stay clear at all times, marked by a painted safety line. As Diane stepped forward, she crossed that line and stopped near the platform edge. An operator told her to step back, but she waved it off and said she was fine where she was, refusing to step back. The instruction was repeated more firmly, followed by a general announcement, but she stayed where she was. The warning was clear, and it was repeated, but she chose to ignore it. Nearby guests began to notice as the platform cycle paused. Staff waited a few seconds for her to move, and when she didn't, the system resumed, and the platform began its reset. At first, the movement was slow and controlled, almost unnoticeable. Underneath, a motor system pushed the platform sideways along a track, steadily closing the gap. It wasn't designed to stop instantly under load, because the system relied on clear, predictable movement to function safely. Because systems like this assume one thing, that no one is standing where they're not supposed to be. Diane was standing inside that gap, and at that point, nothing in the system was going to adjust for that. As the platform shifted, the space narrowed from several inches to almost nothing. By the time operators fully recognized her exact position, the system had already entered its final alignment phase. The moving edge reached her legs first, then her hips, continuing forward as the platform completed its cycle. There was no sudden impact, just steady mechanical force. And this is where everything goes wrong. The platform pressed her backward against the fixed edge behind her. The pressure increased gradually, restricting movement and compressing her torso. From a distance, it didn't look violent. It looked still. But that pressure limited her ability to expand her lungs. Operators hit the emergency stop, but the system didn't release immediately. These systems are designed to stop motion, not instantly reverse compression under load. The platform held its position as staff moved in to disengage it. We've already seen this happen more than once, and this is the part people usually get wrong, thinking everything stops instantly. It doesn't. Systems like this take time. Within seconds, her breathing became shallow, then ineffective. Staff worked to reverse the platform, but the process required controlled movement, not an instant release. By the time they created enough space to pull her free, she was unresponsive. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the outcome had already been set. The forensic findings confirmed compressive asphyxia as the cause of death. There were no major fractures or external injuries, only sustained pressure preventing normal breathing long enough to cause loss of consciousness and cardiac arrest. Ride diagnostics showed no mechanical failure. The system operated within its design. The investigation concluded the hazard was positional. The system worked as intended, but it wasn't designed to account for someone standing inside the moving gap once the cycle began. After the incident, the painted safety line was replaced with physical barriers. Nothing in that sequence failed. The warnings were clear. She just ignored them.
It was December 22, 2018, in Orlando, Florida. The park was crowded, and inside one of the interactive shooting games, guests rotated through stations lined with mounted blasters, flashing targets, and constant sound effects designed to keep everything moving without pause. Daniel Cruz, 26, had been in the park most of the day and stepped inside the attraction to cool off. He worked night shifts as a hotel maintenance technician, picking up extra hours after his younger sister dropped out of school, trying to cover bills their family couldn't keep up with. This trip was supposed to be a break, something simple he could afford. The setup was simple. Stand in place, grab the blaster, and shoot at targets as they lit up. Everything felt controlled and routine, like nothing there could actually hurt you. Daniel took his position as the station opened. The blaster was fixed to a mount with a cable running into the base. Around him, people were doing the same thing, pulling triggers, leaning forward, adjusting their aim. It all felt routine. Then his blaster stopped working. He pulled the trigger again. Nothing. The targets kept moving, but his score didn't change. Instead of stepping back or waiting for the staff, looking down at the base where the cable disappeared into the console, there was a warning label on the lower panel, small, easy to ignore, printed near a seam where the casing met the floor. Most people wouldn't even notice it. Daniel did, but not in the way it was intended. He stepped closer and nudged at the panel with his shoe, like he was testing if it was loose. When it didn't move much, he crouched slightly and used his fingers to pry at the edge, trying to see if something had come loose inside. And I've seen people do that exact thing. Something stops working, and instead of leaving it alone, they start poking at it, like they can fix it in a few seconds. The panel shifted just enough. Not fully open, not broken, just enough to expose a narrow gap behind it where wiring ran into the unit. It wasn't meant to be accessed, but it wasn't completely sealed either. He reached in. It wasn't deep, like adjusting a cable or pressing something back into place. From the outside, it looked harmless. Plastic casing, low lighting, nothing that suggested real danger. But the position forced his weight forward, his balance centered over a narrow base while one hand was inside the unit. As he adjusted his grip, his footing shifted slightly. It wasn't a dramatic slip, just enough to throw off his balance. With one hand still inside the opening and nothing stable to hold onto, he couldn't correct in time. His body tipped backward as his foot lost traction on the smooth flooring. He fell hard onto the ground behind him, the back of his head and neck taking the full force of the impact against the floor. The sound cut through the noise of the attraction, sharp enough to draw attention, but not immediately understood. For a moment, it still looked like a simple fall. People nearby noticed first, then staff. He didn't move. The system was shut down as employees rushed over and cleared the area. Emergency services arrived quickly and began resuscitation, but there was no sustained response. He was pronounced dead shortly after. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death as severe blunt force trauma to the head and cervical spine, consistent with a backward fall onto a hard surface. Investigators found that the panel had been partially loosened, but there was no equipment failure. The unit was not designed to be accessed, and the risk came from reaching into a restricted space while off balance. And when you break it down, the part that stands out isn't the equipment. It's how simple the decision was. He didn't break anything open completely, didn't force tools into it. He just saw something not working, pushed at it a little, and reached into a space he wasn't supposed to touch. It's the kind of thing people do all the time. Tapping machines, checking cables, trying to fix something in the moment because it feels faster than waiting. And most of the time, nothing happens. But this time it did, and that's what makes it feel so unnecessary. It was June 12th, 2015. The afternoon heat pressed down on a steel drop tower as riders lifted slowly toward the top before falling in controlled cycles. Hydraulic systems raised the gondola, while eddy current magnetic brakes slowed the final approach near the bottom. Guests moved between shaded walkways and metal railings under a cloudless sky. Minutes earlier on the platform, Daniel Cross, 26, adjusted the brim of his baseball cap as the ride cycled upward. He worked at a regional warehouse loading delivery trucks on rotating shifts that began before sunrise or ended late at night. He liked routine and clear rules, but friends described him as quietly competitive, the kind of person who sometimes bent small rules just to prove he could get away with it. The drop tower lifted riders nearly 200 feet before releasing them into a rapid freefall sequence. A tall perimeter fence surrounded the tower base because once the carriage was released from the lift system, it descended quickly along vertical guide rails before the magnetic brakes slowed it near the bottom. Daniel rode in one of the outer seats with two friends. As the gondola dropped through the first braking stage, the wind caught his cap and lifted it from his head. It spun downward through the open air and landed on the gravel inside the circular base area beneath the tower. When the ride returned to the platform, an operator reminded riders that lost items would be retrieved after closing. Daniel kept glancing toward the fenced area where the cap had fallen. The heat index was above 100 degrees. The tower cycled every few minutes. Daniel told his friends he would be quick and walked along the midway toward a maintenance gate built into the perimeter fence. The latch had not fully caught. He pulled the gate open just as the next gondola began rising up the tower shaft. Inside the restricted area, the ground was covered with compacted gravel surrounding the tower's central column. Thick steel arms connected the ring of seats to the carriage that traveled along the guide rails. Daniel stepped toward the spot where his hat lay near the base of the drop path, glancing upward briefly as the gondola continued climbing above him. Guests outside the fence noticed him and began shouting and pointing toward the tower base. At the top of the structure, the carriage paused for several seconds while riders looked out across the park. Then, the release system disengaged. The sound changed instantly as the carriage accelerated downward along the guide rails. Emergency services were called as people continued waving and yelling toward the base of the tower, but the drop had already begun. Daniel turned toward the noise as the descending carriage rushed toward the lower section of the tower. He was standing inside the clearance envelope, a circular zone designed only for the moving ride structure. Witnesses described him stepping backward as the gondola approached. The lower carriage frame and footrest assembly passed through the base section at high speed and struck him across the shoulder and upper torso. The impact knocked him sideways across the gravel beside the tower column. The carriage continued downward into the eddy current braking zone, where powerful magnets slowed the ride before it reached the platform. Operators stopped further cycles once reports came over the radio that someone had entered the restricted area. Security cleared the perimeter while paramedics arrived through a nearby service gate within minutes. Daniel was found unresponsive beside the tower base with severe trauma to his chest and head. After assessment, responders determined that the injuries were not survivable. The medical examiner documented multiple rib fractures with both lungs punctured, leading to rapid internal blood loss. There was a fractured skull with underlying brain injury and several broken vertebrae. The pattern of injuries was consistent with high-speed blunt force impact from heavy ride equipment. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma. The ride remained closed for the rest of the day. An internal review later confirmed that the maintenance gate latch had not fully engaged, allowing unauthorized entry into the restricted area. Additional locking hardware and secondary barriers were installed in the following week. It was June 9, 2017, at a small amusement park in Indiana, where the air hung warm and still over a wooden roller coaster that creaked with every passing train. The structure stretched across the park like a lattice of aging timber, its tight curves and overlapping beams creating long, blind sections along the track. From the ground, visibility was limited, especially in the mid-course where the ride dipped low and curved back into itself. Once a train disappeared into that section, it stayed out of sight for several seconds. Caleb Rourke, 32, worked as a maintenance technician at the park. He had a reputation for handling problems quickly, the kind of worker who preferred fixing something immediately rather than shutting a ride down longer than necessary. Earlier that day, operators noticed a train returning slower than expected. It wasn't a full breakdown, but enough to call him in. The ride was stopped, and the last train was held in the station while he entered the track area through a side access point. Standard procedure required a full lockout, a physical measure that prevented the ride from being dispatched. Instead, the system was placed in a temporary hold. It was a shortcut that depended on coordination rather than a physical safeguard. Caleb moved along the track, stepping over wooden cross ties, inspecting wheel assemblies and guide rails along a mid-course section. He located the issue, a minor alignment problem, and reset the component by hand. It was the kind of fix that didn't take long, which made the decision to keep things moving feel routine. Once finished, he began walking back toward the nearest exit platform. The structure around him narrowed the path, beams rising on both sides and limiting how far ahead he could see. At the control booth, operators prepared to run a test cycle. The section where Caleb had been working was completely out of view. Based on the timing and the assumption that maintenance had cleared, they moved forward. The train was dispatched. It climbed and entered the course under normal operating speed. As it moved through the layout, the sound carried ahead of it, the steady rumble of wheels over wood echoing through the structure. Caleb was still on the track, stepping into a crossover section where space tightened between support beams. By the time the train rounded the curve, the distance between them had already closed. There was no clear escape path. The surrounding structure restricted movement to a narrow strip beside the rail. The train entered the section and struck him before a stop could be completed. The emergency stop was triggered, but the braking system required distance to engage fully. The train came to a halt further down the track. Response teams arrived quickly, but Caleb was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation later confirmed that no physical lockout had been used while he was on the track. The ride had only been placed in a temporary hold, allowing it to be restarted without a hard stop in place. The part that stays with me here is how uneventful everything appeared right up until the final seconds. There wasn't anything that would have made someone step back or hesitate. It all blended into routine. Everything depended on timing and assumption. One side believed the track was clear, while Caleb was still making his way off it. There was no mechanical breakdown forcing the situation. It came down to a gap in process. It's uncomfortable to realize how easily repetition can create a false sense of certainty. When a shortcut works often enough, it starts to feel like part of the system, even when it was never meant to be. And looking at how this unfolded, it's hard to ignore how routine it all was up until that point. This wasn't an unusual repair or a rare condition. It was a normal task, done the way it had likely been done before. In the end, investigators focused on that missing layer of protection. Not a broken ride, not a rare malfunction, just the absence of something that would have made restarting impossible while someone was still inside the track area. What makes this case linger is how preventable it feels when you trace it back. Every step followed a familiar pattern, and nothing in isolation looked serious enough to stop everything. But when those small decisions lined up, there was no buffer left to absorb the mistake. And the hardest part to process is how little separated a normal test run from what actually happened. The same track, the same procedure, the same timing. Just one person still inside the structure when everything restarted. No warning carried far enough. No barrier forced a pause. And once the train entered that blind section, there was no time left to